Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take on complex topics, cut through some of the noise, and really arm you with clearer insights.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're navigating a subject that is, well, deeply personal. It's often passionately debated, and yeah, it can feel incredibly polarizing.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the ethics of abortion.
That's right. And we're taking a very specific lens today. We're focusing specifically on the moral arguments, drawing heavily from the analysis in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay.
So this isn't really about the legal fights or the political stances you hear about all the time.
Right.
It's about dissecting the philosophical ideas, the arguments for and against, and the many, many nuanced responses within that whole discussion.
Exactly. So if you've ever felt maybe overwhelmed by the sound bites, our mission here, for you, our listener, is to give you a more structured, maybe a deeper understanding of these different philosophical positions.
Yeah, give you the tools.
We want to equip you with the tools to navigate these complex ideas, help you see the intellectual rigor behind them without us taking a single side ourselves.
Absolutely.
So many of us have these strong, kind of intuitive feelings about abortion, but how do philosophers actually break down the core moral question? Is abortion morally wrong?
Well, philosophy's unique contribution here isn't about telling you what to believe.
Right.
It's more about clarifying the arguments, distinguishing the different kinds of responses, and really highlighting the fundamental issues that are at stake.
Okay.
So we'll be exploring, I think it's 6 key arguments that have been made against abortion, and importantly, alongside the powerful defenses and the objections each one faces.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start? Maybe with the most intuitive one. The idea that a fetus is a person with a right to life.
Yeah, that's often where the conversation begins, the argument from a right to life. It usually follows a pretty direct path.
How so?
Well, premise 1, the fetus is a person. Premise 2, all persons have a right to life.
Makes sense.
Premise 3, therefore the fetus has a right to life. Then premise 4, it's morally wrong to kill something that has a right to life.
Okay.
And 5, abortion kills the fetus. So the conclusion is, abortion is morally wrong.
It sounds very logical, laid out like that. It has that intuitive appeal.
It absolutely does. It frames abortion as, the killing of a person, something we generally agree is wrong. But this is where philosophy comes in. It immediately runs into some pretty significant challenges.
And those challenges center on.
Mostly on what we actually mean by person. That's the crux of it.
Okay, so let's really dig into that idea of personhood, because it seems like that's the critical starting point here.
Exactly. One major philosophical hurdle is something called the equivocation objection.
Equivocation, meaning?
Meaning the word person can be used in, well, at least 2 distinct ways. It can mean a biological human being.
Right, biologically a fetus is human.
Undeniably human, yes. But person can also mean a moral person, an entity with full moral status like you or me, deserving of rights and moral consideration.
Ah, okay. Like having standing in the moral community.
Precisely. And the argument's strength often relies on subtly, maybe unintentionally, switching between these 2 meanings.
How does that work?
Well, if person means biological human, premise 1, fetus is a person, is true, but premise 2, all biological humans have a right to life from conception, becomes controversial. If person means moral person, premise 2, all moral persons have a right to life, is true, but premise 1, a fetus is a moral person, becomes the controversial bit.
So either way, you're making a controversial assumption just by using the word person.
Exactly. The argument isn't as straightforward as it first looks. Philosophers use the term moral status to ask, what beings deserve our moral consideration? What makes something count, morally speaking?
Okay, that clarifies things. But then there's this famous thought experiment, right? Even if we grant the fetus a right to life, it still might not settle the issue. The violinist. Yes, Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist case. It's a classic. It radically challenges what that right to life actually entails.
Remind us how it goes.
Okay, imagine you wake up one morning, you've been kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers,
Okay.
and you find yourself back-to-back in bed with a famous, unconscious violinist.
Yeah.
He has a fatal kidney ailment. You, it turns out, are the only person in the world with the right blood type to help.
Oh, boy.
So they've plugged his circulatory system into yours, so your kidneys can extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The doctors say, look, sorry about this, but he needs you for 9 months. If you unplug him now, he'll die. but in 9 months he'll have recovered and can be safely unplugged.
9 months. So he definitely has a right to life, the violinist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Thompson asks, are you morally obligated to stay plugged in? She argues, compellingly for many, that you are absolutely permitted to detach yourself, even though it will cause his death.
This suggests that even if someone has a right to life, it doesn't automatically mean they have a right to use your body, especially non-consensually, to sustain that life.
So it reframes abortion. How?
It reframes it potentially not as a direct act of killing in the sense of, say, murder, but as the withdrawal of life-sustaining aid that one isn't obligated to provide. That distinction is crucial.
Okay, but I can hear the objection already. Some might jump in and say, but the violinist case is about being kidnapped. What about pregnancies that arise from consensual sex? Isn't there a responsibility factor there?
That's a very common response, a fair point to raise. The argument is that consensual sex implies some level of responsibility for the fetus's dependence if pregnancy occurs.
Right.
However, Thompson actually explores variations of the case to address this. Imagine, for instance, knowing that kidnappers might target people in your area, but you still choose to live your life normally, maybe even leave your windows open. If you're then kidnapped and hooked up to the violinist, does that prior risky behavior obligate you to stay plugged in for 9 months? Thompson suggests probably not. It suggests that even if one is somehow responsible for the situation arising, that responsibility doesn't automatically translate into an obligation to provide 9 months of significant bodily support, especially when that support is what she calls onerous, extremely demanding.
So it really pushes us to think about what a right to life actually means, doesn't it?
It really does. It clarifies that a right to life probably isn't a right to be given whatever is necessary to sustain life from anyone and everyone.
Like I don't have a right to demand someone's kidney even if I need it to live.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or, Thompson's other example, you might be dying and the only thing that can save you is the cool touch of Henry Fonda's hand on your fevered brow.
Right.
Henry Fonda might be in the next room, but he has no obligation to walk across and touch you, even though he could easily save your life. The violinist has no absolute right to your kidneys.
So the right to life is maybe narrower?
It might be better understood as a right against being unjustly killed. And once you rephrase premise 4 of the original argument that way, abortion kills the fetus unjustly, well, proving that becomes far more complex and controversial than just saying killing is wrong.
That makes sense. What about self-defense? Does that idea come into play?
Yes, it does sometimes. Some argue that if a pregnancy threatens the pregnant person's life, it could be seen as self-defense against an innocent threat. Thompson uses an analogy of a rapidly growing child in a tiny house who will crush you if not removed.
Okay.
But this raises other questions, like what philosophers call agent-relative permission, basically. Does the right to self-defense only apply to the person being threatened, or can someone else, like a doctor, act on their behalf?
Interesting distinction.
But I think the core takeaway from the violinist framing is often less about self-defense and more about this idea of withdrawal of aid. That seems to fit many cases better.
Okay, so we've tackled personhood and what right to life might mean. What about the argument from potentiality, that a fetus could become a person?
Right. Another significant challenge to the basic right to life argument. This objection questions whether simply having the potential to become a person with a right to life is enough to currently grant that right.
How is that challenged?
Well, think about the kitten serum case, an example from Michael Tooley. Imagine we discovered a serum that, if injected into kittens, would cause them to develop into beings with rationality and self-consciousness like ours.
Okay, smart cats.
Right. Would we then be morally obligated to inject all kittens? Or, perhaps more relevantly, would it be seriously morally wrong to, say, painlessly euthanize a kitten before giving it the serum, or even neutralize the serum before it works?
Probably not, most people would say.
Exactly. Most people think that wouldn't be wrong in the same way killing a person is wrong. This suggests that potentiality alone doesn't present moral status or a right to life.
Are there other angles on potentiality?
Yes, some philosophers talk about the actual future principle. This view suggests that maybe only fetuses that will actually have a future like ours, meaning they will survive to become conscious persons, have significant moral status based on that future. Fetuses that will naturally miscarry before consciousness develops wouldn't have that status under this view.
That's a complex distinction.
It is, and it leads into related objections as well.
Like what? What other contentions challenge that foundational right to life argument?
Well, there's the self-consciousness objection. This argues that to truly have a right to life, in the strong sense, a being must be capable of desiring its own continued existence.
Which requires
A concept of oneself as a being that persists through time. Self-awareness. Fetuses, particularly early ones, lack this.
So no desire means no right.
That's the strong version. A slightly weaker claim is just that consciousness, the capacity for experience, is necessary for having any interests at all. If something can't experience anything, can anything be good or bad for it? This would at least defend very early abortions before consciousness develops.
Okay. And there was one more.
Yes, the miscarriage objection. This is more of a practical observational point. Miscarriages, unfortunately, are incredibly common. At least 10%, maybe significantly more, of known pregnancies end in spontaneous miscarriage, often very early.
Right. It's very common.
So the objection goes, if fetuses were full moral persons from conception, equivalent to you or me, then this natural phenomenon would represent a staggering ongoing catastrophe, a massive public health crisis killing millions of persons every year.
And we don't generally react to it that way.
We don't. While miscarriages are often sources of grief for the individuals involved, society doesn't generally treat this level of natural fetal loss with the same moral weight or demand the same public health response as, say, a pandemic killing millions of born people. This perceived discrepancy challenges the claim that fetuses are universally regarded as full, moral persons from the start.
Okay, wow. That first argument, the right to life, is really packed with philosophical layers and challenges.
It absolutely is. It seems simple, but it opens up fundamental questions about personhood, rights, and moral status.
So, given those complexities, let's shift gears. There's another major argument that tries to sort of sidestep that whole thorny personhood debate, right? By focusing on what is lost.
Exactly. That's Don Marquis' influential argument from loss, sometimes called the future like ours argument.
How did that one work?
Marquis argues that the primary reason why killing an adult human being like us is typically seriously wrong is because it deprives that individual of their future.
Their future experiences, projects, joys.
Precisely. A valuable future. A future like ours. He then argues that a fetus also has a future like ours, potentially filled with these valuable experiences.
Okay.
So premise 1. Killing normally deprives the victim of a valuable future. Premise 2. Depriving something of a valuable future is what makes killing typically wrong. Premise 3. Abortion deprives the fetus of a valuable future. Conclusion. Therefore, abortion is typically seriously morally wrong, for the same reason killing an adult is.
What's compelling there is it doesn't seem to rely on calling the fetus a person in the same tricky way.
That's its main appeal. It tries to ground the wrongness in the value of the future life that is foregone, something perhaps easier to grasp than moral status.
But I wonder, does it really escape the question of moral status entirely?
That's a sharp question, and it leads straight to one of the main objections, the moral status objection.
Go on.
Critics argue that the wrongness of killing an adult isn't just about the lost future, it's about losing the future of a being that currently has moral status.
So it smuggles moral status back in.
In a way, yes. If premise 2 is revised to say, depriving a being with moral status of a valuable future is what makes killing wrong, then the argument still needs to establish that a fetus has that moral status to reach its conclusion, so it hasn't fully escaped the problem.
Okay. And what about the future like ours part? Is a fetus's future really like ours in the relevant way, especially early on?
That's another key challenge. The future like ours objection, or maybe better, the connection objection.
Connection.
Yeah, the argument is that early fetuses lacked these psychological and neurological connections to their future that adults have. Things like memories, existing desires, plans, projects, a sense of self that extends over time.
So they don't possess a future in the same way an adult does.
Exactly. An adult is psychologically connected to their future self. Their future is, in a meaningful sense, theirs. For an early, pre-conscious fetus, that connection isn't there. So the argument goes, it's not being deprived of its future in the same morally significant way an adult is. Some call this the time-relative interests view. You only have an interest in your future if you're psychologically connected to it.
That makes sense. Now, how does this argument from loss relate back to the violinist case we discussed? They feel like they're pulling in different directions.
That's a good point to clarify. They actually don't necessarily conflict because they're operating at slightly different levels of the moral argument.
How so?
The argument from loss, Marquis' argument, aims to establish that there is a strong moral reason against abortion, namely the loss of a valuable future. It concludes abortion is wrong unless justified.
Okay, it sets a high bar.
Right. The violinist case, Thompson's argument, often starts by granting for the sake of argument that there might be a strong reason against abortion, like a right to life, or maybe even the loss of a future. But then it proceeds to argue that, nevertheless, abortion can still be justified by other equally powerful considerations.
Like bodily autonomy.
Exactly, like the pregnant person's right to control their own body and not be compelled to provide life support. So Marquis points to a reason why abortion is morally serious, while Thompson points to a potential justification for it, even if it is serious.
Okay, that distinction helps. So one points to a reason for moral concern, the other to a possible justification for the action.
Precisely. They address different parts of the ethical puzzle.
All right, let's move on. There were a few other arguments against abortion mentioned in the Stanford Encyclopedia. What about something simpler, like the Golden Rule?
Ah, yes, the argument from the Golden Rule. It's appealing in its simplicity.
How does it usually go?
Basically. Rule 1, we should treat others as we would want to be treated ourselves. Rule 2, we are glad that we were not aborted. Conclusion. Therefore, we should not abort others.
Simple, direct.
Very. Its intuitive simplicity is definitely its strength. However, the immediate philosophical objection goes back to that tricky word.
Others.
Exactly. Who counts as others in the Golden Rule? A plausible interpretation is that the rule applies most strongly, perhaps only, to beings who already have full moral status.
So we're back to the personhood debate again.
We are. If the fetus doesn't yet have full moral status, then the Golden Rule on this interpretation might not directly apply in the way the argument requires. It hinges, again, on that controversial status question.
Okay. Next up was the idea of intrinsic value. How does that feature?
The argument from intrinsic value suggests that human life itself has a kind of inherent, profound value, intrinsic value, and it's wrong to destroy something with that kind of value without very strong justification.
So it's not necessarily about rights, but about the value of life itself.
Yes. The philosopher Ronald Dworkin famously explored this. He suggested that maybe, just maybe, much of the intense disagreement in the U.S. abortion debate isn't actually about whether a fetus is a person with rights.
Oh. What did he think it was about?
He proposed that perhaps both pro-choice and pro-life sides might implicitly agree that fetal life has intrinsic value, that it's something precious, but they profoundly disagree on the significance of that value. Meaning they disagree on just how bad the destruction of that intrinsically valuable life is and what kinds of reasons, like the woman's well-being, autonomy, life circumstances, are strong enough to justify causing that loss.
So it frames the disagreement as more about weighing competing values rather than a clash over fundamental rights.
Sort of, yes. A disagreement about degree and justification, not necessarily a black and white yes or no question about personhood. It's an interesting attempt to find common ground.
But does that hold up? Do people really agree on intrinsic value?
Well, that's where the objections come in. Critics point out that actually many people on the pro-life side, particularly those with strong religious convictions, like many Catholics, do explicitly view the fetus as a person with a right to life and see abortion as akin to murder, not just the regrettable destruction of something valuable.
So Dworkin's reframing doesn't capture everyone's view.
It seems not. And on the other side, some argue that feelings of regret or seriousness surrounding abortion might not stem from the fetus's intrinsic value per se, but rather from the profound significance and life-altering nature of continuing a pregnancy and becoming a parent. The weight of that decision could explain the gravity without needing to invoke intrinsic fetal value.
Okay, lots to think about there. And the last one in that group was moral risk. That sounds different.
It is quite different. The argument for moral risk takes a step back from trying to prove abortion is wrong. Instead, it focuses on uncertainty.
How does that work?
It suggests that even if you've carefully thought through all the arguments, like we're doing now, and you've concluded that abortion is permissible, well, you might still be mistaken.
We could always be wrong about our moral judgments.
Exactly. There's always a chance, however small you think it is, that abortion is actually seriously morally wrong, perhaps akin to killing a person. The argument then says that taking this moral risk acting in a way that might be catastrophically wrong is itself a strong moral reason not to do it. You ought to err on the side of caution when the moral stakes are potentially so high.
Huh. So the very possibility of being wrong creates a reason against acting.
That's the idea. It raises a really fascinating philosophical question. Does this kind of epistemic moral risk, the risk stemming from the possibility of error in our own moral reasoning, genuinely generate new moral reasons for or against acting? Or do only, say, risks of causing non-moral harms like physical pain or financial loss create such reasons?
That's a deep question about moral reasoning itself.
It is. It asks us to consider our own fallibility as a direct factor in our moral decision-making.
Okay, so those arguments mostly tackled abortion in general. But there was one more specific argument, right? Against selective abortion.
Yes, the expressive argument against selective abortion. This one focuses specifically on cases where an otherwise wanted pregnancy is terminated because prenatal testing reveals the fetus has a condition, often a disability.
And the argument is?
The argument proposes that making the choice to abort specifically for that reason expresses a negative, discriminatory attitude towards people living with that disability.
How so? What does it express?
It suggests the act implies things like people with this condition shouldn't have been born, or they don't have a right to exist, or their lives are inherently less valuable, less worth living. The argument concludes that expressing such a discriminatory attitude is, in itself, morally wrong.
What's interesting there is the focus shifts to the reason behind the abortion, not just the act itself.
Precisely. It highlights the potential social meaning and impact of these choices, particularly from the perspective of disability rights advocates. Many disabled persons strongly advocate that a life with a disability is not inherently a worse life, just a different one.
Makes sense. What are the counter-arguments or objections to this expressive argument?
There are several important ones. First, the burdens objection.
Meaning the burden on the parents or family.
Yes. This objection points out that the pregnant person or couple might not believe the child's life itself would be less valuable. Instead, they might be concerned about the very real practical difficulties, the lack of adequate social support, or the immense resource demands involved in raising a child with significant needs within their specific family context. Their reason isn't about the child's value, but about their capacity to provide adequate care.
Okay, that's a practical consideration. What else?
There's the objection from preventing disability. This points out that we generally think it's permissible, even good, to try to prevent disabilities from occurring in the first place. Think about taking folic acid to prevent neural tube defects or vaccinations.
Right, we do that all the time.
So if it's okay to prevent disability before conception or during early development, why isn't it okay for prospective parents to aim for a non-disabled child via selective abortion if that's their preference? It challenges the idea that selecting against disability is inherently discriminatory.
Okay. Any other major objections?
Yes, a couple more. One questions whether expressing this attitude, even if it is negative, actually causes harm to currently living disabled people beyond the harm they might already experience from existing societal prejudice. Is the abortion choice itself adding significant harm?
The harm principle.
And finally, there's an objection from equivocation about value. This draws a careful distinction. It says there's a difference between believing that having a certain disability would be bad for the person who has it, 8G involves pain, limits opportunities, and believing that persons with disabilities are less valuable as people.
Ah, a subtle but important difference.
Very. The objection argues that selective abortion typically expresses the first belief, a concern about the well-being or challenges faced by the future child, not necessarily the second, more globally discriminatory belief about the value of disabled persons in general.
Okay, that really unpacks the nuances of that specific debate. We've covered a lot of ground, a really complex landscape of philosophical arguments.
You certainly have.
So let's try to connect this back and maybe zoom out a bit. Beyond the intricate details of each argument and objection, why does exploring the ethics of abortion matter so profoundly for our listeners, for society as a whole?
Well, I mean, if abortion were straightforwardly considered murder, its importance would be pretty self-evident, right? The stakes would be incredibly high.
Yes.
But even if, after careful consideration, one concludes that abortion is, in many or most cases, morally permissible, the discussion remains absolutely crucial. And I think the philosophical focus, especially on things like the violinist case, while incredibly important for theory, can sometimes be a bit misleading in capturing the full picture.
How so? Misleading.
Because it tends to highlight primarily the burdens of pregnancy itself, the 9 months of bodily connection, the physical demands, which are real, of course.
Right.
But arguably, the deeper, more fundamental story, the reason why access to abortion is seen as so critical by so many, is actually about the burdens, the responsibilities, and the entire life-altering nature of motherhood or parenthood more broadly. It's about a fundamental aspect of human liberation and self-determination.
So it's not just about the 9 months of physical gestation.
Exactly. It's profoundly about the autonomy and the freedom of women, and let's be precise, anyone who can become pregnant, to decide whether to become a parent and when to become a parent. That decision shapes a life perhaps more than any other.
And without access to abortion.
Without access, many individuals are essentially consigned to parenthood, often at times or under circumstances they would not choose. This fundamentally impacts their education, their career, their relationships, their entire life trajectory and sense of self-determination. The burdens of pregnancy are temporary. The commitments of parenthood are, for most, lifelong. That's the bigger context.
That's a powerful point. But what about the argument you sometimes hear that adoption is always an available alternative to parenthood, making abortion access less critical?
That objection, while sometimes made with good intentions, often overlooks a really critical aspect of human psychology and experience.
Which is?
Many people who become pregnant, even unintentionally, develop a deep bond with the fetus during the course of the pregnancy. The idea of carrying that fetus to term only to then relinquish the resulting child for adoption is, for many, emotionally unbearable or simply not something they're willing to do.
So adoption isn't always a straightforward emotional or practical alternative for the pregnant person.
Not at all. For many, the choice feels like it's between abortion and raising the child themselves. Therefore, restricting abortion access doesn't just prevent an abortion, it effectively compels parenthood for many. It forces them, as one philosopher put it, to turn a fetus that they think does not matter at all into a child they deeply love, fundamentally shaping their lives and limiting their autonomy in ways that the mere option of adoption cannot fully address.
So it really comes back to that issue of forced parenthood and its impact on autonomy.
Yes. That's why the ethics of abortion remains such a cornerstone issue for discussions about human agency, individual life paths, bodily integrity, and social equality. The personal stakes are just incredibly high.
Wow, what an incredibly rich and, yeah, at times quite challenging deep dive into the ethics of abortion today. We've really explored arguments from the right to life, the argument from loss, the golden rule, intrinsic value, moral risk, and those complexities around selective abortion.
It truly demonstrates how deeply philosophical thinking is interwoven with, the most profound personal experiences and also broad societal structures. It really highlights why clarity and nuance in our thinking are just absolutely vital, especially on issues like this where emotions and deeply held beliefs run so incredibly high.
Definitely. And for you, our listener, we really hope this exploration helps to clarify the many distinct and often conflicting moral considerations that exist out there. It's clearly not just a single pro or anti position.
Not at all.
It's a complex tapestry of ethical questions that thoughtful people have grappled with for decades, using different frameworks and reaching different conclusions.
And perhaps it begs a powerful question for all of us to consider as we move forward. If, as our discussion suggested, a core ethical importance of abortion access lies in protecting the autonomy, the self-determination, the life trajectory of anyone who can become pregnant, then what follows from that? What broader societal structures, what support systems, what distribution of care and resources are we, as a society, obligated to build and uphold to ensure that this autonomy is genuinely realized? Not just in theory, but in practice, regardless of the personal choices people make about pregnancy or parenting.
So it's a question about our collective responsibility.
Exactly. A responsibility, perhaps, to create conditions where choices about family, career, and life are genuinely free and supported for everyone.
That is definitely something powerful to mull over as you continue your own journey of informed understanding. Thank you for diving deep with us.